Alrighty, everybody, we're going to hit you up with another presidential election. This one, the election of 1816. The War of 1812 has come to an end. James Madison is ready to retire after 2 terms. So who is going to step up and take his, who's going to step up and take his place? Let's find that out right now. Alright, so we're always going to start as usual with the incumbent party, and that is the Democratic Republicans. The incumbent president is James Madison. He's going to take the same road as Washington and Jefferson did before him, and he's going to walk away after 2 terms. So the Democratic Republicans are left once again to determine who is more than likely going to succeed, who could succeed James Madison. And the list of their presidential candidates, we have the Secretary of State, James Monroe of Virginia. Early in the American presidency, the Secretary of State position was usually a stepping stone to the presidency. Jefferson was Secretary of State, Madison was Secretary of State, and now Monroe could potentially be going from the State Department to the White House. But Monroe is going to have some opposition from the governor of Pennsylvania, Simon Snyder, and the governor of New York, Daniel D. Tompkins. Now, also considered was the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay from Kentucky, and Senator Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, but they both declined to run. Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, repelled a British invasion in the Battle of New Orleans, the final big-time battle of the War of 1812. Now, there was widespread sentiment, especially in New York, that it was time to end the Virginia dynasty. But Monroe's long record of service at home and abroad made him a fitting candidate to succeed Madison. Now, Monroe is also facing opposition from the Secretary of War, William H. Crawford of Georgia, but Crawford never formally declares himself a candidate because he believed that he had little chance against Monroe and fears such a contest might deny him a place in a Monroe administration. But still, Crawford's supporters pose a significant challenge. But at the end of the day, it is going to be Monroe who receives the nomination of the Democratic Republicans for president, and the governor of New York, Daniel D. Tompkins, is going to be nominated as vice president. Now, the Federalists, they're on the brink of collapse at this point. They've been discredited by their opposition to the War of 1812 and by their actions at the Hartford Convention, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So the caucus of Federalist congressmen didn't even bother to make a formal nomination, but many Federalists supported Senator Rufus King of New York as president. So he was kind of informally nominated for the position. And the Federalists are going to nominate John Eager Howard, a former senator from Maryland, as vice president. So the Federalists on the verge of collapse, but can they pull? Can they pull a cat out of the hat, something out of the hat, so to speak, and get it done? We'll see about that in just a second. Now, Madison's second term came to be dominated by the War of 1812. And the War of 1812, for lack of a better term, did not go well for the Americans. The Americans losing on land, the Americans losing at sea. In August of 1814, the British ended up burning Washington, forcing President Madison to flee. The only time that an American president had faced enemy fire, and the only time the American capital was occupied by a foreign power. Wanted to see an end to this war. President Madison sends a delegation to negotiate peace with Britain, and that succeeds with the Treaty of Ghent. That restored the status quo between these two nations. Nobody really won the War of 1812. But before the news of the treaty was able to get to the United States, remember we're in the early 1800s, we don't have any Facebook, we don't have Instagram, we don't have cell phones, we don't have TVs to break the news. So it took a long time in those days to communicate news, especially from across the Atlantic Ocean. And the Battle of New Orleans is already fought and won by the Americans before the news of the signing of the treaty reached the United States. But nevertheless, the war's over. The war had not ended in victory for the Americans or the British, but the peace that was concluded in 1815 was satisfactory for the American people, and the Democratic Republicans received the credit for its conclusion. Now, the Federalists faced a lot of problems in this campaign. They found themselves pretty much discredited by their opposition to the war and the secessionist rhetoric from New England embodied by the Hartford Convention of 1814 and 1815. Federalists, dissatisfied on how the government was being run, got together and met and got together and held a convention called the Hartford Convention. They called for a repeal of the 3/5 compromise, and they also proposed a 2/3 majority for the admittance of congressional approval for the admittance of new states into the Union, and for declarations of war. And they actually talked of New England seceding from the Union. So they were attempting to really start the Civil War in 1814, 1815. Because had this succession happened, the United States would have more than likely been plunged in the Civil War. But this does not happen. Their demands of the demands for repealing the 3/5 compromise and getting a 2/3 majority in Congress for the admittance of new states and for declarations of war did not happen. So the Federalists were pretty much done for after the Hartford Convention. And also, President Madison did a complete political 180. He had been opposed to protective tariffs. He had been opposed to a national bank throughout his whole political career. But he learned that if the United States was going to conduct another war, they would have to be prepared for it. So he ended up getting a charter for a new national bank, and he also passed protective tariffs. So Madison really changes his tune, just like Jefferson. He doesn't like, neither of these guys really like big government, but Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase and Madison with his conduct of the War of 1812. And what came out of it, these guys actually expanded the power of the federal government. So this leaves the Federalists basically running on rubber legs street now, and with very few issues to campaign on. Now, before we get to the results, we're going to talk about a dispute with Indiana. On February 12, 1817, the House and Senate met in joint session to count the electoral votes for president and vice president. This is what always happens after the election has concluded, kind of like certify the election in a sense. The count proceeded without incident until the roll call came to the last state to be counted, Indiana. At that point, Representative John W. Taylor of New York objected to the counting of Indiana's votes. He argued that Congress had acknowledged the statehood of Indiana in a joint resolution on December 11, 1816, whereas the ballots of the Electoral College had been cast on December 4th. He claimed that at the time of the balloting, there had been merely a territory of Indiana, not a state of Indiana. Other representatives contradicted Taylor, asserting that the joint resolution merely recognized that Indiana had already joined the Union by forming a state constitution and government on June 29, 1816. These representatives pointed out that both the House and Senate had seated members from Indiana who had been elected prior to the joint resolution, which would have been unconstitutional had Indiana not been a state at the time of their election. Representative Samuel D. Ingham then moved that the question be postponed indefinitely. The House agreed almost unanimously, and the Senate was brought back in to count the electoral votes from Indiana. Speaking of electoral votes, let's get to those results right now. Monroe is pretty much going to destroy Rufus King in this election. He's going to easily become the 5th president of the United States. He's going to win 183 electoral votes. Rufus King only manages to get 34 electoral votes. Monroe carries 16 states. It was concluded that Indiana's electoral votes would count. Rufus King would only carry Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Delaware. In terms of the popular vote, it's pretty much a landslide there too. 68.2% for Monroe, 30.9% for Rufus King. And this is really the last time that the Federalists contested a presidential candidate in this election. After this, the Federalist Party goes the way of the dodo bird, and the Democratic Republicans are really left as the only party running the show in the United States. Now, the Federalists still had some strongholds in the North, but pretty much Democratic Republicans are running the show. Monroe's going to serve his first term, and he's going to go for the second term in the election of 1820. That election we'll talk about next time. Alrighty, I hope you enjoyed this video on the election of 1816. If you haven't seen any of my previous videos, go ahead and watch those if you want. Excuse me, and with that, we will see you next time.